Fast-paced building, pillaging Vikings, and enough fire-breathing dragons that this game could be confused with Game of Thrones. What is going on, guys? It's Canthev here, and today we're going to be taking a look at kingdoms and castles. So Kingdoms and Castles is a city building strategy game about growing your kingdom from a small farm town into a bustling city filled with vibrant villagers and impressive buildings. Life's not all fun and games, however, because increasingly challenging waves of Vikings and dragons periodically attack your city, truly testing your ability to design and grow a well-balanced kingdom. Before I get into the specifics about the game, I'd like to give you guys some background. Kingdoms and Castles was initially funded through Fig, a video game crowdfunding platform, and managed to raise $108,000, which was 700% of its original goal. It was released on July 20th of 2017, which is about 1 week from when I recorded this video, and can be purchased on Steam for $9.99. I'd like to share my first impressions about the game, what I'd like to see in the future, and whether or not this is a worthwhile investment. Like most other city building strategy games, Kingdoms and Castles relies on a few core mechanics involving resource management and occasional wildcards to test the player's ability to tactically manage their kingdom and hopefully grow their city. The gameplay feels very familiar to other games in the same genre, most notably the game Banished. I will say, however, that Kingdoms and Castles is much less punishing when making a wrong decision. In Banished, one wrong decision could kill half of the town's population and ultimately make it impossible to keep the town operating, and really turn me away from wanting to try new tactics and be risky because it could wipe out my entire town. I didn't feel this way in Kingdoms and Castles. There are 3 modes to play on, with the hardest mode having the most invasions and the possibility of actually losing your kingdom altogether if the villagers' unhappiness grows too high. The hardest mode challenges and punishes the player, similar to how Banished does, but the other 2 modes provide a much more forgiving experience, which is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. I found that the ability to set your difficulty to be very beneficial to the game because it felt like it provided enough flexibility to fit the many different play styles that people have. And if you're finding it hard in the harder difficulty, or if you want to try a new tactic, it's really easy to just go in, switch the difficulty, and try something new. Collecting resources is fairly straightforward. There's barren, fertile, and very fertile land. Buildings can be built on land regardless of fertility, but farms and orchards must be built on either fertile or very fertile land. The fertility of the land adds a little depth to the planning of your kingdom, but can sometimes complicate and annoy me if I can't place a farm exactly where I want to. I feel more often than not that I have to work around the problem of soil fertility, but I suppose that's why it was included. Wood is initially collected by manually chopping down trees, but you can place forester buildings to automatically harvest and replant the trees. If you manually chop down a tree, it will never grow back on the same tile. This could potentially lead to deforesting the entire island without more trees growing, but that would be a very hard thing to accomplish. All other resource collection is what you would expect from other games. With regards to buildings, there are a few choices for housing which allow for flexibility, but towards the end of the game I find myself only building manors, which are the largest, because they're the most efficient housing type. There are other standard buildings that either boost happiness, create more complex resources such as tools and armaments, and buildings that unlock other buildings or defenses. But after placing the main buildings, I found myself only having to build farms and houses to expand, because most of the other buildings only need to be placed one time. This simplifies the late game a lot and ultimately detracts from playability in the long run. I'm hoping that this will be fixed as the game progresses in development, but in its current state, there aren't enough buildings to keep the game playable for a long time. That being said, there's enough variation in the island and resource generation that I can start new kingdoms and it still feels fresh. Every few years, Vikings or dragons attack the town. They never attack villagers, instead they try to burn down all your buildings. I typically don't worry when an attack is incoming because instead of building the traditional defensive buildings, I stick to building as many wells as I can because they greatly reduce the risk of your buildings burning down. Attacks have become more of a nuisance than enjoyable because it feels like I would never get punished for not killing the attackers. I eventually surround the kingdom with walls and towers, but I never feel the pressure to do that until around 50 years in. To take a look at the size of the island that's generated, I felt pretty constrained with the amount of space available for each game, but that's not necessarily a complaint. I personally think it makes the game feel cozy and challenges me to be efficient with my building placements, but I could see it frustrating players. Having the option to adjust the size of the island would definitely increase playability and fit the desires of many different players, and I could easily see it being implemented into the future. Kingdoms and Castles has some of the most beautiful graphics that I've seen from any game in my Steam library. I find the low polygon style to be very calming and enjoyable to look at, and it adds a certain simplicity to the game. The only issue I have with the graphics is that there's a thin layer of fog which blocks the view of your kingdom when playing at a steep angle, and it'd be nice if the fog effect could be toggled in the menus. Right now, the only graphical enhancements that you have are really different like shading options, and then to enable or disable clouds or birds. So to get a little more depth to the graphics options, I think would be a great addition to the game. As far as sound and soundtrack, they feel very similar to the graphics. Basically, it's light and enjoyable to listen to, and it definitely enhances the game. I particularly like the satisfying thud of a new building being placed down and how the music gets louder the closer you zoom into the kingdom. That being said, I typically play my game a little further zoomed out, and it would be nice if I could have the option to listen to the music at the same level no matter how far I was zoomed in or out. Now let's get down to the hard parts, replay value and bang for your buck. The true replay value, I believe, comes from the first 50 to 100 years of the game. When you're first starting out, struggling to efficiently use the small resources that you have, and building as quickly as you can to get your kingdom established before attackers pillage your village. After reaching a population of around 200 or so, I felt a noticeable drop-off in my enjoyment of the game. There are a lot of ways that the developers could enhance the replayability and life of this game, and I'll touch on the specifics later on. The $10 price tag, however, seems very reasonable for the content and the potential that this game has. Banished at $20 has roughly the same amount of content and hasn't been updated in multiple years. The trade-off between the cost and the potential this game has is well worth the $10 for me. If you don't feel the same way, you could always wait until more content gets released into the game and then see if it's worth buying in the future. To summarize, let's take a look at some of the pros and cons for the game as well as some suggestions. Starting with the pros, Kingdoms and Castles has some amazing graphics and sound that really enhance the overall look and feel of the game. The unique wave-based defense system adds an extra level of complexity and enjoyment to the game, but at some times can feel like a chore or even a bit cavalier. Finally, the $10 price tag provides enough value for anyone who's looking for a cheap new game to get into, especially considering that it has a lot of potential. Obviously, this is a double-edged sword because the developers will either deliver or fail to deliver, but for now I'm pretty hopeful, so I'm going to list that as a pro. Now for the cons, the most obvious gripe that I have with Kingdoms and Castles is the lack of enjoyment that I get from the late game. After putting in hours and hours to develop my kingdom as a bustling metropolis, I feel like I should be rewarded. Instead, expansion becomes much more of a chore with a lack of impactful decisions to make. Additionally, the attacking system can easily be ignored or worked around by building wells instead of towers and defenses. There's also no reward for successfully stopping the attackers. The allocation of workers as well to build tasks can be frustrating, as they prioritize whichever task was queued first. It would be nice if I was able to assign villagers to specific buildings, which gives me more control, but I could understand why they don't have that in the game because it makes it a little more difficult. So I've come up with a few major suggestions that I'd like to throw out to see what you guys think. My first major suggestion would be to add an attacking system on top of the defense system. That would be similar to Clash of Clans. It'd be really cool if I could attack other kingdoms and see which players could cause the most damage to the opponent's kingdom. The winner would be awarded maybe like resources from the loser's base or happiness to their village or whatever. And I think this would really address two major issues: the lack of playability in the game and the ability to ignore the current defense system. If I had to fortify my base against other players' attacks, I'd focus much more heavily on fortifying my kingdom. I'd also like to see some quality of life updates, most notably the ability to allocate villagers to specific buildings, as well as more graphics and sound settings to allow for more customizability. Adding more buildings and farms to the game would also add some variety. Ultimately, I'd rate Kingdoms and Castles as an 8 out of 10. The bang for your buck is an obvious component of my rating, as you get a lot of content for the $10 you spend. The cons, while not avoidable, definitely aren't game-breaking and can be addressed in future updates. Kingdoms and Castles has a lot of potential to make it its mark as a premier city building strategy game, and its unique style is sure to make a lasting impression. If you found my review to be helpful, then please drop a like, and if you have any suggestions or comments about the suggestions that I outlined, then please let me know in the comments section below. If you're interested in seeing more content like this, then make sure to subscribe. My name's Canthev, and thanks for watching.